Thank you to the Allen Public Library for hosting me, and I just want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. There are a million things you could do with your Thursday night, especially at this time of year, I imagine. And so I really appreciate that you decided that this was the thing that you wanted to do. Like Tom said, I'm at SMU, where I teach in the history department, and I'm the associate director of the Center for Presidential History there. I did my graduate work at Texas A&M, my undergraduate degree at Dallas Baptist, and I hail from Odessa, Texas. So I've moved all around the state and have found myself lucky enough to get to stay here. As Tom said, as you all are, I'm sure, aware, we are celebrating 250th anniversary of our country this year, and really we'll probably see this sort of thing over the next 7 years. Because as you might know, the war lasted 7 years, and why celebrate only one when we could celebrate for 7 or more? If you count the Constitution, maybe we'll add another several more into that. And there are a lot of directions that you could go when you're thinking about the 250th and what are we thinking about regarding American heritage. And I thought, I've never been to the Allen Public Library despite just living in North Dallas. And it's an important occasion, and it's a bunch of people that I don't really know. And so let's do something non-controversial, religion and politics. No one ever fights about this. Of course, it's not something that we agree on often. Church and state, religion and politics, our politicians, our communities, even our houses of worship, our families perhaps, are divided over these really tricky topics. And I want to suggest that a reason for that, I think maybe even an encouraging reason for that, is because we all actually deeply care about this topic. And we think that understanding it or getting it right, whatever that relationship is actually really important if we want to understand our country's history and how our nation is supposed to function on these topics to this day. I find this topic incredibly fascinating. Most of my research and writing looks at the issue of religion and politics in early America in different ways, including through missions, as Tom mentioned. And I find it fascinating. I also find it complicated and oftentimes really frustrating. And so I hope to offer you some fascinating things tonight and perhaps frustrate you just a little bit as well. And I thought, with the many ways that you could talk about church and state and religion and politics, that this would be a really helpful window to do it, a window of a person that probably everyone in here has heard of, Thomas Jefferson and his life and times. And I want to share with you just 4 eras of Thomas Jefferson's life, and during those 4 eras, 4 documents that he wrote that will tell us something about his views on church and state, but also, given his incredible influence, church and state and their relations in the early republic, broadly speaking. So not just Thomas Jefferson, but what we can learn from early America. So I want to walk through those with you tonight. I hope provoke some questions, and we can have some time afterwards for you to ask questions and for us to have a bit of a discussion. Right, so first, I want to look at an early era of Jefferson's life when he was Delegate Jefferson. April 1776, so just over 250 years ago, Thomas Jefferson turned 33 years old and was a delegate to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia in June of 1776, so just a few weeks from now, 250 years ago. At age 33, he drafted the Declaration of Independence. What are you doing with your life right now? I am put to shame. The Declaration, Jefferson said, was necessary because the 13 colonies, or the 13 states as they were styling themselves, deserved equality among other nations because of, quote, the laws of nature and of nature's God. He then wrote in the document these words that you know very well. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, it's really important for us to ask questions when we read old documents. The older they are, probably the more questions we should ask. What did Jefferson mean by some of these words, like nature's God and endowed by their Creator? We shouldn't assume in the present day that we can just adopt a historical actor's words as they are and then pull them into the present and say, yep, he definitely means what I mean. He's on my side. Whatever my side is, that's the side he's on. And I'll give you another example just from this same passage that I just read. The phrase, all men. Now, whatever he meant by all men, I think it's probably obvious to all of us in here that he did not define all or men in the same way that we probably all would define all men. He meant something more narrow, more specific than we might say. And I want to suggest to you that Jefferson had some particular meanings when he said things like creator or nature's God. So, for example, the word creator. Jefferson meant a deity who brought the universe into being. Not too much more than that. Some deity, some all-powerful being that brought the universe into being. What about an endower of rights? He says that people were endowed by their creator. Well, this creator in Jefferson's taxonomy endowed basic natural rights. And by being made by the same creator, all people at some level were equal before God. Now, not equal in their talents, not equal in their station of life or in the power that they should be able to have in society, but at some level, equal before a common creator. Jefferson later, in the final draft of the Declaration, added that the delegates were, quote, appealing to the supreme judge of the world. So when they wrote this declaration, they weren't just writing it to the people or to complain to the king or the parliament. They were writing it appealing to the supreme judge of the world. What does he mean by this? Well, a few years later, just a few, Jefferson wrote in his famous book, The Notes on the State of Virginia, he wrote this: I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. What was Jefferson writing about when he said, I tremble that God is just? He was writing about slavery. He feared that if the U.S. did not solve this problem, and he saw it as a problem, that God's judgment would come upon the country, very possibly by the enslaved rising up in revolution against their enslavers. So this is the judge that Jefferson is talking about. And finally, another word that he doesn't use in the Declaration, but that he and many of his contemporaries used often was the word providence. Jefferson talked about providence, as did Washington and others, consistently. Sometimes he saw providence as a generally impersonal force, directing or overseeing the affairs of the world. Other times, he saw providence as a more active force, like an impatient judge, the one we just referred to. Incidentally, I think it's important that we hear these words and kind of correct a little bit of a myth, I think, that's out there popularly, which calls Jefferson a deist. When we talk about deism, usually the common metaphor that you might have heard that we talk about is the idea that God is a clockmaker. And what that means is that this deity, whatever he was or whoever he was, made the world, made the universe, and like a clockmaker, after he set it in motion, stepped back and then didn't touch it anymore. And that's kind of a pretty safe view of what deism is. But that's not quite Jefferson, because if you're a deist, you don't really believe in an active providential judge who's going to come and judge the deeds of the people around you. So he's something a little more than a general providence, but something a little more than also a deist. And all these ideas, creation, equality, judgment, providence, Jefferson and his peers embedded in the Declaration, directly by the language they wrote into it, and indirectly by the dominant political and moral philosophies of the day. So Delegate Jefferson, in writing this document, is putting explicit and common religious language, although maybe not the same kind of language or the same meaning we might have today. So that's Delegate Jefferson, 1776. What about politician Jefferson? Look at the next decade of his life, from 1776 to 1786, when Jefferson served in the Virginia House, and he served as the governor of Virginia, and then he would serve as an ambassador. Here's a key idea I want you to hear in this section. And that is this, that Thomas Jefferson advocated for government, or what he might call the state, at every level, both state and national, that would give no official preference to any particular religion. Okay? That the state would give no official preference to any particular religion. That state institutions should, in fact, not act regarding church institutions at all, positively or negatively, except if they're protecting people's rights to practice their religion freely. All right? So this is the idea that Jefferson advocated that the state should not give its preference to a particular religion, that it, in fact, its main job was to protect people's right to practice their religion freely. And we can see this most clearly in his writing and in his lifelong advocacy for a particular document, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Now, you may or may not know this. Has anyone been to Monticello before or seen Jefferson's grave? And if you've been there, you look at the tombstone, and you see that by his own wishes, he put 3 things on that tombstone, 3 things of all the things he did that he wanted to be known for. Author of the Declaration of Independence, founder of the University of Virginia, and third, author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which I hope you find maybe a little bit odd or surprising because many Americans have never even heard of this, and yet Jefferson thought, of all the things I did in my life, it's one of the most important 3. What is this? Well, in the decades leading up to 1776, Virginia, like most of the other colonies, just like it was in England and Scotland, had an established church, just like it was in Spain and later places like Mexico as well. What did it mean to have a church establishment? Well, in Virginia, in the colony of Virginia, and later in the state of Virginia, that establishment was the Church of England, or the Episcopal Church later. And what did this establishment mean? Well, if you lived in Virginia in 1776, the Anglican Church received tax support. If you paid taxes in Virginia, which you had to, some of it supported the church. It meant that Anglicans experienced preferential and favored status in the law. It meant that there were religious tests for office. You could not serve in the Virginia House or in the Virginia State Assembly if you didn't, for example, express a belief in God, belief in the Old Testament and the New Testament, believe in an eternal state. And in Virginia, not only was the Anglican Church favored, but other groups were disfavored, even experienced punitive actions. For example, Baptists. There's a lot of Baptists around here these days, right? In Texas and throughout the South. Baptists in Virginia in the 1760s were persecuted pretty regularly. Some pastors were even jailed if they were not preaching at the particular times and in the particular places that they were allowed to preach. This was similar in most other colonies and even after the Revolution in most other states. And Jefferson and his friend James Madison wanted to end this kind of religious establishment, starting in their home state of Virginia, but ultimately in the U.S. as well. And so he began drafting this statute. And during this time, 1770s, while he was serving in various political offices, he kept one big 2-part idea in mind. And I referred to this at the beginning of this section. Big 2-part idea on church-state relations. One is disestablishment, and the second one is religious freedom. Disestablishment, making it where one group didn't get favored status, and religious freedom, making it where all groups had the ability to practice freely. He pushed against establishment and pushed for more freedom. But this bill, early on in the 1776 and the years after, had a hard time making its way through for a couple of reasons. So first of all, it had opponents. For example, his chief opponent, someone you might have heard of, Patrick Henry, another very famous Virginian. He hated this idea. He made staunch arguments against this bill. He made staunch arguments for continuing a religious establishment because he believed that state and tax support for a religious establishment was good for the moral order of the state, and that if you didn't support this kind of thing as a state, it would be bad for the moral order and all kinds of, moral chaos might erupt. Jefferson, in his own sarcastic way, countered this idea, and he said, Jesus said in the Gospels that he would build his church and the kingdom of hell would not prevail against it. So I think we'll be fine in Virginia if we disestablish the church. So he had opponents, very powerful opponents, but also there was a war going on in 1776, 1778, 1779, and so it was hard to get this through. And it eventually would pass in 1786, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, after the end of the Revolution, before the Constitution comes. And after the war, Jefferson had ended his term in the House, and he had actually moved to France to become a diplomat to France. And while he was gone, his friend, James Madison, shepherded through Jefferson's bill. And it was very hard fought. Again, his chief opponent, Patrick Henry, he was back, and he continued to oppose it. At one point, Jefferson got so frustrated with Patrick Henry's opposition that he sort of half-jokingly but half-seriously wrote to Madison that they maybe should become prayers. Again, they weren't much of prayers themselves, but maybe they should start praying, and possibly they could pray that Henry might die. And then their chief opponent for this would go away. That Virginia statute for religious freedom did a few things. It guaranteed in Virginia entire religious liberty for anyone. It guaranteed in Virginia that there would be no preferred church or preferred denomination by the state. It made it for the first time where there would be no forced attendance to church or no limitations on any particular group's attendance. And it would not have any longer in the state taxes that would support a particular church, in this case, the Episcopal Church. That should sound familiar to you, this idea that there would be no religious establishment and that people would have free exercise. What does that sound like to you? Sounds like the U.S. Constitution, which would be written and ratified in the years immediately after the Virginia statute. Another document that only mentions religion really 2 times. And it mentions it once to say, no religious tests in the United States for office. Means if you want to serve in the United States Congress or as president, you don't have to take a test to say what you believe. And secondly, famously in the First Amendment, it says what? No, Congress shall establish no particular religion, and that it will guarantee free exercise. These are the ideas that came especially out of Jefferson's and Madison's Virginia. So that's politician Jefferson in this intervening time. Then when I want to jump forward to the next period in his life, after he returns from France and continues serving in the cabinet, he then, of course, becomes himself President Jefferson, elected in 1800. And when you think of President Jefferson, what's the first thing that comes to mind? I gather, if you're anything not like me, and you're not thinking about these things all the time, it's probably not this picture. It's probably not cheese. When you think of Jefferson, you probably don't think of cheese. You think of other things. By the way, this is, I'm generally suspicious of all things AI generated these days as a history professor, but it's really good for some things. And if you really want to draw a picture of Thomas Jefferson on the White House lawn having a big cheese delivered to him, AI is great for that. So just putting that out there for you. Now, this might be an AI-generated image, but it's telling us actually a real story that happened. Okay? Jefferson, on January 1st, 1802, this is the setting. Jefferson has been in office for about 9 to 10 months, elected to the presidency in November of 1800. And one of the most bitter elections still in American history, and resulting in the first real peaceful transfer of power in American history, right? Something we would all do well to remember. And arriving on the White House lawn, January 1st, 1802, a cheese, 4 feet wide, 15 inches thick, 1,230 pounds, made by the Baptist ladies of Cheshire, Massachusetts, escorted to D.C. by wagon and by boats, by land and sea, by the famed preacher of the time, Baptist minister of Massachusetts, John Leland. It had arrived in Washington, D.C. after, I think, certainly several weeks. It might have been a couple months on boat and wagon. And it arrived there on December 29th. And on January the 1st, they held a ceremony out on the White House lawn, which used to be a much more common thing, by the way. They would just have parties on the lawn. Anyone could just show up, right? So slightly different these days. You got to get your congressman to approve you to visit one room, I think. And at this ceremony, Leland, who's AI pictured here on the left, presented this cheese to Jefferson. And engraved on the cheese was a phrase that Benjamin Franklin had promoted and Jefferson had promoted: rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Now, you, I hope, are asking yourself the question, why? Why are Baptists in Massachusetts sending a giant cheese to Thomas Jefferson? Well, do you remember what we just talked about, that second document that Thomas Jefferson wrote, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom? Well, the Baptists in Massachusetts remembered this document too. Because even in 1801, this is well over a decade after the writing of the Constitution, well into the United States as a nation, in New England, there were still religious establishments. The Constitution had ensured, in fact, that there would be no national established church. Right? The U.S. Congress could not establish a church or prefer a particular church. And states like Virginia had disestablished their denominations. They had disestablished the Anglican or the Episcopal Church. But many states, especially in New England, like Massachusetts, still had an established church. And what that meant, for example, if you lived in Massachusetts, was if you lived in a town in Massachusetts in 1801, almost certainly, unless you went through a very complicated rigmarole, when you paid your taxes, some of your taxes went to support the town congregational church and the town's congregational pastor, regardless of whether you were congregational or not. And the Baptists of Cheshire County, Massachusetts, sent this cheese as, quote, a mark of their exalted esteem for Jefferson, who they called a real sincere friend to all Christian denominations. Now, that would have struck a lot of people as very strange because in the election of 1800, there were plenty of newspapers printing that Jefferson was an atheist and an enemy of all Christian denominations, and that if people elected him, he would send soldiers to come to your houses and pull you out of your homes and take your Bibles and burn them in the streets. I'm not making this up. So if you think the press is real bad now in presidential elections, it's been there before. And that's just the Baptist of Massachusetts. Because this isn't even the most famous thing. Perhaps some of you have never even heard of this before. This isn't the most famous Baptist correspondence that Jefferson had. That belongs to the Danbury Baptist of Danbury, Connecticut. Because that very same day, January 1st, 1802, no doubt inspired by the synergy of the cheese and the Baptists, Jefferson sat down at his desk and he wrote a letter to another group of Baptists who also lived as minorities under another religious establishment in Danbury, Connecticut. Now, Jefferson had absolutely no idea, I feel confident in saying, that this letter would become one of, if not the most important document in American religious history, American history on church-state issues, the Danbury letter. And in that letter, which you can see here, perhaps you can't read from back there, he wrote these words: I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Everyone heard that phrase before? Wall of separation. Let's stop for a second. Wall of separation. Couple things. First of all, it's arguably the most consequential phrase on this topic of church-state relations, a principle that much of our law via elected bodies and through the Supreme Court over the years has been built on. Also important, it is not in the Constitution. The phrase is not in the Constitution. It's quite literally Jefferson's thoughts or commentary on it in a personal letter that he was writing to the Danbury Baptists. So it's this interesting blend of a principle that the country had, at some level, was founded on and that has been passed down through law and jurisprudence, but also that doesn't actually appear in the founding documents that govern us themselves. So the big question is, what is this wall and what's it dividing? At least according to Jefferson, we know a few things. This is a wall, it is not a wall, between religious ideas and politics. According to Jefferson, it's not a wall between religious ideas and politics. He talked about religious ideas all the time, privately and publicly. Remember, the cheese, okay? He had a big party on the lawn with some Baptists who were celebrating his ideas on religion and politics. So it's definitely not that. It's also, according to Jefferson, not a wall between religious practices by government or government officials. Now, that one's a little bit more bold of a claim, that Jefferson is not saying that government or government officials should refrain from any kind of religious activity. Let me give you a couple of examples of why I believe that, just in Jefferson's presidency. 2 days after this, on January 3rd, Thomas Jefferson attended a Christian service, a broadly Christian service with a lot of members of Congress, where John Leland, that same preacher who brought him the cheese, preached. And do you know where that service was held? at the U.S. Capitol, where they held regularly broad, kind of interdenominational religious services. Another example of why I might say this is that during Jefferson's presidency, his War Department at the time, what became a State Department and is now confusingly one or the other, depending on who you talk to, funded missionaries to Native American groups. Now, he funded them, and the State Department funded them because he believed that these missionaries would be ideal ambassadors to Native peoples. Because at the time, if you wanted someone who was going to at least be a good go-between between the U.S. government and Native peoples, you kind of had a few choices. You had soldiers, probably not a good idea. Settlers who were just moving on to Indian land, also probably not a good idea. And missionaries, best idea available. But both of these were examples of Jefferson's government, Jefferson's presidency, continuing things that Washington had started and would go forward, of the government and even governing officials doing what seemed like religious things. So it's not that. Here's what I think it was, and what Jefferson, I believe, said it was. That it was a wall between the state and giving sectarian or preferential treatment to a particular religious body. Right? So the wall is not between all religion and politics. The wall is not between even government doing religious things, but it is a wall between the power of the state, whether that's national or state level, giving particular preferential treatment to one group over another. A postscript on the cheese. Reports were that the cheese remained at the White House for at least the next year and was out on the lawn again the next New Year. It was reported in some newspapers as late as March of 1804, 2 years later, where it was described as, quote, very far from being good. But the key idea here, I hope you'll remember more than just cheese tonight, is that it actually stands for something bigger during Jefferson's presidency and in his life. Jefferson, a very far from Orthodox Christian or Protestant, had no greater supporters during his presidency than American Baptists. And that support was for one very specific, clear reason, and that is because Jefferson believed and was arguably the lead advocate for the separation of state and church institutions and power. And Baptists, who experienced life in New England and not long before that in Virginia, as minorities, as people who were oppressed at some level by other Protestant denominations, those Baptists believed that Jefferson was their champion because he believed that the state should not prefer one religious group over another. So that's Thomas Jefferson as president. And finally, our fourth time for Jefferson is Jefferson in retirement, 1810 to 1826. Now, Jefferson, through a lot of his life, had a very personal writing project, a very personal religious writing project. We talked about the Religious Freedom Act. We talked about how he wrote the Declaration and wrote this letter, but he had a very particular personal religious thing that he was writing as well. He started it while he was president, gave it up for a little while. Apparently, it's a busy time when you're president. But he came back to it in his retirement. But he only communicated about it privately in letters with friends. He was very private about this religious project, in part because he was a very individualistic man. He had his own thoughts. He thought of himself as a free thinker. But he was also very concerned that if these writings got out, there would be a lot of public blowback, that maybe people like those Baptists who really liked him might not like him very much anymore if this project got out to the public. And that project was what we've come to know as the Jefferson Bible, what he called, the full title, The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, extracted textually from the Gospels in Greek, Latin, French, and English. I think Jefferson Bible flows off the tongue a little better, right? And this was an expression of Jefferson's theology. Here are some examples of what I mean by that. Jefferson claimed through most of his life, as far as I know, that he was a Christian. But he claimed that he was a Christian in the only way that Jesus ever meant for people to be, that he was attached to Jesus' teachings above other teachers, that he saw Jesus as a most excellent human, and, key, that Jesus himself never claimed otherwise. So Jefferson's, I don't want to mix those two up. Jefferson's view was that he was a Christian, but what he meant by that was that Jesus was a moral teacher, that he was an excellent moral teacher, and that he never claimed otherwise, and so other people shouldn't claim that either. If you know anything about broad Christianity, you know that that sort of strikes at a key doctrine, which is the doctrine of the Trinity or the divinity of Jesus. Jefferson rejected these ideas. He and John Adams, who also rejected these ideas, they joked in correspondence one time. They said, even if we were transported to Mount Sinai and we were there with Moses, and God himself directly told us there's a Trinity, 3 in 1, 1 in 3, they wouldn't believe it. So, how does this come out in Jefferson's Bible? Well, Jefferson's Bible reflected these beliefs in very specific ways. Jefferson's version of the Bible. Now, you're looking at an original scan of what Jefferson's work, his own work, right? So this isn't later. This is something Jefferson did himself, okay? This is what he did. He took printed editions of the Gospels from multiple languages, as it was said in the subtitle, Greek, Latin, French, and English, and you can see those across there in parallel. He took those, and then he got his little penknife out, and he cut out the sections that he believed were the legitimate teachings of Jesus, that Jesus actually said, and he left a bunch of stuff that he thought Jesus never said or did. And all that stuff he left that Jesus never said or did was anything to do with the miraculous or anything to do with Jesus claiming anything more than that he was a good teacher, that he was claiming he was divine or something like that. And then he took them out and he glued them on paper so that he could have his own version of the Bible. And I want you to look, if you can see, it's very small, but if you look up in this top right corner here, you can see what is a J9 and a J10. This refers to the Gospel of John, chapter 9, and the Gospel of John, chapter 10. And if you're familiar with the Gospel of John at all, you might wonder, isn't John chapter 9 a little longer than that? The answer is yes, it's much longer than that. It's the story about Jesus healing a blind man, and there's this whole thing about how he heals him, and then there's a discussion about whose fault was it that he was blind. Jefferson just cut all that out, and it just like, blind man, why is he blind? Who knows? Move on to John 10, all right? This is Jefferson's Bible. He left out everything that was miraculous or that appeared that Jesus was saying anything about being miraculous or divine. And never published this in his lifetime, never spoke about it publicly in his lifetime. This document was passed down in his family for generations, eventually purchased by the Smithsonian in 1895. They published it in 1904. Right, so Jefferson did not want this to get out. Why am I telling you this? Is kind of the final spot here when we're thinking about church-state relations in Jefferson's life. The key is not necessarily to examine Jefferson's theology, although that's a totally worthy project, and we could do that in a separate talk. But it is to say this. If you find yourself looking to Thomas Jefferson in today's world as some sort of paragon of like a proto-evangelical Christian that's like a founder who wants to support your views in American government, you are barking up the wrong tree with Thomas Jefferson. He was a free thinker, and he was a deep paradox on his views on things like Christianity, and he really won't fit in our boxes today. He just won't. So, let me move toward a conclusion here. So what? This is shocking, and many of you may know this, but it seems almost impossible. It's the kind of thing that if someone wrote it in a story, you would say, well, that's ridiculous. That would never happen. And that is that on July the 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence, both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the same day, exactly 50 years after the Declaration. This kind of thing begs us to think about their legacy and to reflect on it, just like they did even in their own time, especially in a year like this one when we're thinking about the anniversary of our country, a time to reflect on victories and amazing things, but also maybe a time to reflect on some difficult topics so that we can learn some things. Now, this can be a dangerous game. I often tell my students at SMU that if you're just looking to history for moral lessons, it can be very difficult because you may have heard this phrase, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And you want to be careful to just look back and go, well, I understand that, and so let's make a moral for it. And that's especially true for someone like Jefferson, who was so complex. But even then, I think there are some really broad principles on a really live topic like church-state relations that I think we can learn from Jefferson. and his complexity and the way that his views on these are filled with a lot of tension and quite frustrating, frankly. So I want to bring a little of that frustration and complexity to us today. Here are 3 ideas that I want to close with here. One is this: we should jealously guard against our governments making laws or policies which grant favor or benefit to one religious group over another. That we should guard against the government favoring one particular religion over another. Jefferson, as well as many of the Constitution's writers and the Declaration's writers, they advocated for this. Not that there should be no crossover between religion and politics, or not that we couldn't talk about things, but that the government should not show preferential treatment. That's the idea embedded in the Constitution. The second one is this: that we should simultaneously accept, and I might be so bold as to say encourage, that our fellow citizens can and will be religious, and that they will advocate for their positions in religious ways, with religious ideas, including in the public square, including during election seasons, and that there is a very big difference between religious institutions, religious denominations, getting preferential support from the state, and religious people getting involved in their government. And that cuts every way, for every religious group, for every religion. And that, I think, American freedom is wide enough and big enough to handle a lot of different views with different convictions. So one, that we should guard against our governments making laws that are for particular groups. We should accept and encourage that people are going to be religious and practice that publicly. And third and finally, that we should live really happily in this tension. I think, this is my own view here, that this is actually one of the things that makes the United States truly great and relatively unique in the world. That we have this tension, that it's embedded in our laws and our society, and that we get to have it. And that everyone can practice their religion or their lack thereof without fear of the government preventing their exercise, without fear of being favored or disfavored just because they're a particular religion, and with really great confidence that we do this in a long and rich history of church-state relations in America, much of which we owe to Thomas Jefferson. Thank you very much for your time tonight. Now, thank you so much. Now, I would love...
Questions, comments, protest.
I welcome
the library. You can say what you want.
I welcome your questions and protests.
Hold on just a second.
And please, sorry, I should say, he's going to bring the mic to you so that everyone can hear you well. So just throw up your hand and we'll find you.
Thank you. You had, when you were mentioning right there, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and then you went in to explain how Jefferson viewed the word creator. And I was just wondering, do we have evidence or do you know what Jefferson's view on all men, what he meant by that? Did he mean people or did he mean men?
Yeah, well, he definitely didn't mean all people, particularly in the context of whose rights were going to be given here, right? So in one sense, he did mean this idea that everyone's endowed by their creator. And so in one sense, I'm sorry, I want to correct myself. In one sense, he did mean all humans because they share a common thing, and that's that they're all created by the same God. So all humans have some sense of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But we also know, and surely most of us know here, that he definitely meant that in a very general and yet narrow way, because he did not believe, for example, that all actual human men were given full rights to freedom by their creator, right? We would just look to the hundreds of people that he enslaved throughout his whole life. He did not believe that they had the same rights to life or liberty or pursuit of happiness or property. And he never did. He never did.
Do you think that the framework they created, though, they were wise enough to hold a belief that they were practicing in their everyday life, but knowing that they needed to create a framework that was broad enough to create, a great nation like America?
Yeah, I don't know if I would necessarily say wise enough, but it is right to say that Jefferson, Washington, several of them, they knew slavery was a problem. and they spoke of it as a problem. I mean, Jefferson believed that the country would be judged for it. So it's not that they ignored it, but there's sort of a, wisdom. When you ask the question about wisdom, which I think is a good word, wisdom has not just to do with knowledge or ideas, but it also has to do with how you put those things into practice, right? And so in that sense, they didn't really practice their wisdom because they had the ability to. I mean, there were plenty of people who were abolitionists and advocating for the ending of slavery throughout the U.S. in 1776. Jefferson was very much not advocating for that. He hoped it might come someday, but that it would come not by him. Someone else would do it. Yeah.
Questions, comments?
Got one in the back here, and then one in the gallery.
Okay, let's do the back.
Which patriot or patriotic writer do you feel expressed Jefferson's views, overall, Jefferson's views than anyone else?
Do you mean like a present day person, or
No, back then, a patriotic of the 18th century.
who would have also expressed Jefferson's views?
Most closely expressed his views.
Could you maybe tell me views on what?
Well, I'm throwing a broad net out there, so maybe you can define. If somebody were like me to ask you that question, how would you rope me in and say, okay, let's tighten it up and say, okay, on
Well,
on
if you're
religion,
thinking
on
about his
government.
broad views on government and on rights and how individuals should relate to the government and the rights they have under our Constitution, I mean, the closest person is someone I mentioned tonight is James Madison. I mean, he and Madison were they lived relatively close to each other. Most of you, if you visited Monticello, you may have also visited Montpelier. It's not that far away in Virginia. They lived very similar styles of life, although, I mean, they were certainly different people. But they were both plantation owners. They both enslaved people their whole lives, and yet they both wrote sincerely about ideas like liberty and freedom and the way that should be practiced in a democratic society. So that would be the other person I would look to. Yeah.
Questions? Okay.
Well, I know she raised her hand first. Is it okay? My question was in regards to, we know like John Adams has a lot of correspondence with his wife, and those letters show us that even though women were not specifically included as pronouns within the Constitution, they did recognize that it was an important part of this new America, right? Does Jefferson have any similar correspondence or anything alluding to his wife or alluding to the women that maybe have influenced him?
I'm blanking exactly when it happened, but I believe it was before Jefferson went to France. His wife had died. And so during this period of kind of the rush of all this from the war all the way through his presidency, at the time when John Adams and Abigail Adams are corresponding like vigorously, he's not corresponding with her. He has correspondence he has a voluminous correspondence, but as far as I know, not that kind of correspondence with like a woman who he considered his equal. But he is corresponding all over the Atlantic, even with like the thinkers and the writers of the day, philosophers, and yeah. Hope that answered okay. It's not a very satisfying answer, but if you've never read, like, there are good collections of letters between John and Abigail Adams, and they're amazing.
His writing about church and state, what effect did that have on the reaction of the British and the king? Was that something else they felt like they needed to put down as opposed to giving freedom to the colonies? Did that enter into, no, this can't happen?
Did he connect kind of his views with separating churches?
Well, because they had the Church of England, taxes were paid to them and so forth.
Right.
Did that enter into, no, we've got to stop this, besides just, no, we can't let these colonies be free? Did that enter into the fight at all?
It entered into the discourse. There's a couple things I would say. So people like Jefferson definitely connected the idea of an established church with tyranny. They thought that the idea that there would be a particular church that would have favor over another from the top down, and that regardless of your status, you would have to support that, they saw that as a small t tyranny. So people like Jefferson absolutely would have connected that. But I have to be clear, like many Americans would not have connected that at all. I mean, many Americans fought in the Revolution so that they could establish their own churches in their own states. They were not fighting many for religious freedom as we might conceive of it today. Another way it did play out that is a little bit of a sideways way is that a lot of people in the years leading up to 1775 and 1776 were very concerned about the role or rise of Catholic powers, which many Protestant or Protestant adjacent people saw as ultimate tyranny, that the Pope and the Catholic Church would be a threat to the colonies. And so there are complaints even in the Declaration of Independence that allude to the idea that the king was going to be friendly to Quebec, which was a Catholic area in Canada, and that this was a problem for the colonies. So there were connections being made, but not necessarily the kind of direct thing that influenced a lot of, fighting patriots.
Questions?
Tom's getting his steps in tonight.
All right, a couple of things. If I'm not mistaken, there was also a lot of not anonymity, but like some form of. I know that there was a lot of Catholics in Maryland as well during that time. So I know Maryland still joined up with the Revolution, like any of the other colonies at the time, but weren't there still some Protestants that were at the time that were kind of not fearful, but like I can't find the word. Sorry.
Suspicious of, or
yes, that.
Oh yes, yeah. The general Protestant population of the 18th century was default suspicious of Catholics, and that would have been in the American colonies. It would have been in Europe. Catholics, for example, in Maryland, had to kind of go overboard to prove their loyalty and their worth. But there was a general suspicion of Catholics and Catholicism as being antithetical to what many people saw as liberty.
Yeah, all right. And then lastly, regarding slaves, apparently there was quite a few slaves that were a little bit non-Christian as well, like either still practicing some form of their native religious traditions, or some of them being Islamic. Mm-hmm. And if I'm not mistaken, Thomas Jefferson himself even had a copy of the Quran as well in his own personal library, and even had even had correspondence with Islamic caliphates during his presidency, if I'm not mistaken. I know that he himself said many things about Islam and whatnot, but many of it was just, hey, we, the United States, should, as a government, does not discriminate based on religion in general. However, during that time, there was still a lot of discrimination on a more local level, mostly with Christians, against anyone that wasn't Christian. And that also goes for enslaved Africans that were still practicing their native traditions, along with Native Americans that were still being pushed off their lands at the time.
Yeah. Sorry, what was the question embedded there?
I was trying to ask. Sorry. My question was how How did Jefferson try to address any of this?
Okay.
Even while having all of that still go on in the country at the time.
I mean,
That's my
Jefferson didn't do a lot of open addressing of persecution of like non-Christian religions. Now, he did believe that everyone should be able to have religious freedom. So, for example, he like vigorously defended the idea that people could be atheists or free thinkers. And like you said, he was interested in other religions. He had a copy. We know he had a copy of the Quran in his personal library, and he read it and studied it. So he himself had a very broad view of what it meant to have a religious liberty in the U.S. That didn't necessarily translate on the local level to broad support for that, but he supported that for sure.
Any last questions? Okay.
Right up front.
Could you restate what the context for his quote regarding the nation being judged for slavery was?
Yeah, I mean, the context of the quote, yeah.
Right, whoa, I forgot where it came from.
Yeah, the context of the quote was in a book he wrote called The Notes on the State of Virginia. And he, in that book, deals with all sorts of topics, everything from farming to feral dogs to slavery. And what he is commenting on is this idea, I'm pretty sure it's in that same book, where he gives this metaphor of America and slavery as like holding a wolf by the ears. And what he meant by that was that like this is a dangerous thing. It's not good for us, but we can't let it go because it might kill us. And so what he's writing about is this understanding that he knows and writes openly that slavery is a moral wrong, and that he doesn't think it should be a thing that should remain in the United States for a long period, that he hopes it will go away. And that if it doesn't go away, and they don't actually take actions toward moving away from it, that the U.S. would experience God's judgment. And that the particular way he believed that judgment might come was through the revolts by the enslaved. Is that
Yes.
good for you? Okay, great.
That was a good question and good answer. One last question. I'll ask the last question.
All right.
Abigail Adams made it very clear to her husband, John, she was for education for all children, not just some, all of them, opposed to slavery, and for the women's right to vote. I think I learned from you tonight, maybe because Jefferson's wife had died, some of his attitudes might have. Certainly, Abigail influenced John, so it's.
She influenced Thomas Jefferson also. I should have thought, you talked about John and Abigail, but actually Jefferson and Abigail wrote as well. So he thought very highly of her.
One of the sweet stories on a personal level about Jefferson and Adams is I recall they were kind of at odds, and Jefferson thought that he would never see Adams again. And then all of a sudden, was it Jefferson who sent Adams the book that Adams sent Jefferson the book that his son John Quincy wrote and said, "What do you think?" This is after they hadn't talked to each other in 10 years.
Yeah.
And then they developed this quick friendship of exchanging letters, some of the best communication we have in American history. And I just thought that was, on a personal level, it showed how two people who thought politically different can become personal friends.
Yes, well, that can happen when you think totally opposite of each other, if you can believe of your opponent that they actually also want the good of the nation and that you just think differently. And perhaps if you both want good for your nation, you can maybe come together and figure that out. Yeah.
Lastly, as I understand it, Jefferson freed the slaves, descendants of Sally Heming. Is that correct?
He made some very particular, moves on that, but not everyone, no.
But not everyone.
No.
The thing I always like to stress about Jefferson, he was starting to get us thinking that this is a wrong. He didn't take the bold step of saying we need to get rid of it, but he started people thinking Is that correct? That this was something we need to work on?
Well, he didn't start people thinking. Plenty of people were thinking about it.
Right.
Yeah, there were a lot of people thinking about it. I think it's a really important thing for us to remember. It's easy for us to look back and say, well, there were people of their time. They couldn't really do anything, you know, and I mean, it's true, you know, slavery in the United States is not part of our time, and it was part of that time. But there were people openly writing against slavery. There were people openly freeing the people who were enslaved by them. It was happening during their time. People had choices to make, and many chose to do so, and many chose not to. But Jefferson, it is right to say, did believe it was wrong and was trying to move in that direction. He just didn't maybe move as quickly as he may have should have.
We'll end on that positive note. Thank you, Dr. Brian Franklin.